What does it mean to be faithful even when the odds are against you? What does it mean to carry the burdens of others, to walk into the storm, not because you are unaware of the danger, but because your loyalty to a higher cause commands it? In a world filled with self-interest and convenience, we seldom see a soul so committed, so unwavering, so completely given over to love, truth, and sacrifice. Yet history, sacred history, is not short of such lights. One such blazing star is Mola Abbas, a name that echoes with valor, loyalty, and unfathomable spiritual depth. Unwavering loyalty and submission to divine will is not a concept confined to ancient texts or spiritual stories. It is a living, breathing invitation extended to every believer who seeks to walk the path of truth. In the life of Mola Abbas, this concept becomes more than just a theological idea. It becomes incarnate. It takes flesh in the choices he made, in the battles he fought, in the tears he shed, and in the blood he spilled. His loyalty was not circumstantial. It did not depend on comfort or convenience. It was the kind of loyalty that stands firm when everything else falls apart. It was the loyalty that defies logic, surpasses fear, and answers only to the voice of God. Mola Abbas's submission was not passive. It was active, intentional, and deeply spiritual. When Abbas chose to walk beside Imam Hussain, he wasn't aligning with a political movement or seeking personal honor. He was surrendering his entire being to a divine mission, to a truth so pure that compromise was not an option. This is the kind of submission we see in the life of Jesus, who in the Garden of Gethsemane prayed, "Not my will, but yours be done." Abbas's will was fully surrendered to the will of God as revealed through the leadership of his Imam. He didn't question, he didn't calculate the risk, he didn't weigh his options, he obeyed. Such obedience is radical. It doesn't come from mere religious knowledge or cultural identity. It comes from a heart completely devoted to God. Mola Abbas shows us that true submission flows out of love. He loved Imam Hussain not just as a brother, but as the representative of divine authority on earth. His loyalty was deeply rooted in faith, not in blood. That is why his loyalty never wavered, not even when his hands were cut off, not even when he lay bleeding on the hot sand of Karbala. Loyalty that is rooted in God cannot be destroyed by circumstances. In Christian spirituality, we often talk about dying to oneself. Abbas lived that principle with unparalleled intensity. He emptied himself of ego, of desire, of personal ambition, and took up the banner of truth. He lived not for his own safety, but for the success of the divine cause. This is where Christian discipleship and the example of Abbas meet. Jesus said that if anyone wants to follow me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. Abbas denied himself to the ultimate extent. He carried his cross to the battlefield. He followed truth even when it led to suffering. His loyalty was not blind. It was illuminated by divine insight. He knew that standing with Hussain meant standing against falsehood, injustice, and tyranny. He understood that loyalty to God sometimes means turning your back on the world. He didn't just remain at the side of Hussain when things were good. He remained when it was dangerous. He remained when it cost him everything. That kind of loyalty is rare. It is prophetic. It is transformative. Abbas didn't just obey orders. He offered his heart. He asked permission to go to the battlefield. He sought not honor, but usefulness. He wanted to serve. Even his final request to bring water for the thirsty children was not about heroism. It was about compassion. His submission was expressed in service. His loyalty bore the fruit of selfless action. That is the kind of life that pleases God. We live in a time where loyalty is often conditional. People are loyal to their jobs as long as the paycheck arrives. They are loyal to relationships as long as needs are met. Even faith becomes transactional. Believe in God as long as life is good. But Mola Abbas calls us to a higher kind of faith, a faith that holds on even when the heavens are silent, even when the outcome is martyrdom. He calls us to a loyalty that is not shaken by fear or hunger or loss. He calls us to submit not out of duty but out of love. In Mola Abbas, we see the heart of Christ reflected in the desert of Karbala, the same surrender, the same obedience, the same sacrificial spirit. This is not just an inspiring story from another faith. It is a sacred echo of our own calling. We are not called to easy lives. We are called to faithful ones. We are not called to win the world's applause, but to hear the whisper of God saying, "Well done, my faithful servant." That is the reward of true loyalty. That is the crown of genuine submission. That is the legacy of Mola Abbas. Sacrificial love reflecting Christ is not just a poetic idea, but a divine principle that lies at the very heart of both Christian theology and the legacy of Mola Abbas. Love that costs nothing is not love at all, it is convenience. But love that bleeds, that chooses suffering for the sake of another, that lays itself down while expecting nothing in return. That is the kind of love that shakes heaven, transforms lives and reveals the very nature of God. In the life and martyrdom of Mola Abbas, we find this kind of love radiating with a light so powerful that it transcends centuries, cultures, and creeds. His love was not rooted in emotions or affections. It was rooted in truth, in a divine calling, and in a covenant that went beyond the temporal into the eternal. When Mola Abbas stepped forward to serve Imam Hussain, he wasn't driven by sentimentality. He was driven by conviction. His heart was fully tethered to a cause greater than himself. He understood that real love doesn't cling, it releases. It does not calculate cost, it pays it. It does not protect itself, it exposes itself for the sake of the beloved. This mirrors the very core of Christian faith. The cross of Christ is not a symbol of victory won through might, it is a declaration of victory won through surrender. Jesus did not conquer by killing, he conquered by dying. He didn't silence his enemies with threats, he silenced the accuser with mercy. Mola Abbas walked the same road. He entered the battlefield not to assert power, but to defend the powerless. His sword was drawn not for bloodlust, but for justice. His every step was a prayer, every strike a proclamation. Love will not bow to tyranny. Abbas's love was sacrificial because it was other-centered. He didn't fight for himself. He wasn't trying to survive. He wasn't trying to build a legacy. His entire existence in Karbala was to protect and serve Imam Hussain and the message he carried. It was a love that saw the suffering of children, the desperation of the camp, the anguish of thirsty souls, and responded with action. Even when he had a chance to drink water from the river, he refused because his beloved ones were still thirsty. Who does that in a moment of mortal exhaustion? Who denies themselves relief in the face of sure death? Only someone whose love has surpassed the natural and entered the divine. That moment where Abbas tasted the water with his eyes but not with his lips is more than just a historical act. It is a spiritual teaching. He denied himself so that others might live. That is the gospel in action. When Jesus hung on the cross, he too had every right to call down angels, to rescue himself, to end his suffering, but love kept him there. He bore the nails not because he was helpless, but because he was loving. And Abbas, standing under the burning sky of Karbala, mirrored that same sacred silence. He too had strength. He too could fight. But he chose to pour himself out, to offer himself up, to surrender to something holier than survival. His love, like Christ, was not transactional. It was total. This is the love that saves, the love that redeems, the love that makes saints out of mortals. And this is the love the world cannot understand. The enemy thought that killing Abbas would extinguish the spirit of the camp. But what they didn't know is that sacrificial love never dies. It multiplies, it spreads. It grows stronger in death than in life. That's why the story of Abbas still brings people to tears. That's why his name still breaks hearts and ignites faith. Because love like his is divine. For the Christian, Abbas's love is not foreign, it is familiar. It is the same love that turned fishermen into apostles, that transformed persecutors into preachers, that drove missionaries into hostile lands, and that fills martyrs with joy even in chains. Sacrificial love is the beating heart of the Christian life. It is the calling of every follower of Christ. And when we see it lived out in someone like Mola Abbas, we are reminded that God's love knows no borders. Truth is recognized not by the label it wears, but by the cross it bears. Mola Abbas challenges us not to speak of love cheaply. He demands that we examine whether our love endures when it hurts, whether we can give when it costs us something, whether we are willing to go where love leads even if it's through fire. Because that's the path he walked, and that's the path Christ walked before him, and that's the path we are all called to follow. Sacrificial love does not ask, is it safe? It asks, is it right? It does not whisper, what do I gain? It cries, what can I give? That was Abbas. That is Christ, and that must be us. Faith over fear, purpose over preservation. These are not mere words, but a battle cry for every soul standing at the intersection of comfort and calling in a world driven by self-preservation, where survival is often idolized above purpose. The example of Mola Abbas disrupts the narrative. His life doesn't just inspire, it convicts. It holds up a mirror to our hesitation, our compromises, our excuses. Abbas stood on the battlefield of Karbala not because it was safe, not because the odds were in his favor, but because his purpose called him there. He did not ask whether he would survive, he asked whether he would be faithful. And in that choice, he gave us a model of courage that resonates deeply with the heart of the Christian faith. Fear is one of the greatest obstacles to faith. It whispers lies about what we could lose. It amplifies the threats. It paralyzes action. But faith sees through the fog. Faith remembers what fear forgets, that God is greater than the storm, that purpose is more important than preservation, and that obedience is more powerful than outcomes. Mola Abbas walked in his truth. Every step he took was a rejection of fear. Every action he made was a proclamation that purpose would define him, not circumstances. He did not let the size of the enemy army dictate his decision. He didn't let the sight of thirsty children crush his resolve. He didn't let the thought of his own death pull him away from his mission. His heart was set on a higher purpose, and nothing, absolutely nothing, could move him from it. This unwavering sense of purpose reminds us of the faith walk of countless biblical figures. Think of David standing before Goliath, a shepherd boy with a sling facing a seasoned warrior. Fear would have said retreat, but faith said advance. Think of Esther entering the king's court, knowing she could be executed, but choosing to speak up for her people. Fear would have silenced her, but purpose propelled her forward. Think of Jesus in the garden. He sweat like drops of blood as he wrestled with the cross. Fear would have begged for escape, but love and purpose led him up Golgotha. Mola Abbas walked that same road. He knew that his life was not his own, that his calling was greater than his comfort, and that victory does not always look like survival. Sometimes victory looks like surrender. Sometimes it looks like death. Sometimes it looks like a man standing firm when everything inside him has every reason to run. What Abbas teaches us is that courage is not the absence of fear, it is the refusal to be ruled by it. He felt fear, how could he not? He was human. But his faith was stronger. His mission was clearer. His love was deeper. He stepped into the battlefield not for glory, not for recognition, but for truth, for loyalty, for love. He didn't flinch when the enemy surrounded him. He didn't waver when his hands were severed. Even in agony, his spirit soared. Because when your eyes are fixed on the eternal, the threats of the temporary lose their power. That is the kind of faith the gospel calls us to. That is the kind of boldness the Holy Spirit gives. That is the kind of purpose that must burn in our hearts. In the Christian journey, fear will always try to have the last word. It will disguise itself as wisdom. It will present caution as virtue. But we must remember that there are moments when silence is betrayal, when passivity is sin, and when playing it safe is the most dangerous thing we can do. Mola Abbas refused to be safe. He chose to be faithful. He didn't preserve his life. He offered it. And in that offering, he found eternal honor. We are not called to live for safety. We are called to live for truth. The gospel of Jesus is not a message of comfort. It is a call to courage. It demands everything and offers even more. But we must step forward as Abbas did, choosing purpose over preservation, faith over fear. Our world needs people like that. Our churches need people like that. People who don't just attend services but embody sacrifice. People who don't just speak of faith but walk in it, bleed for it, and if called, die for it. That is the legacy of Mola Abbas. Not that he lived long, but that he lived right. Not that he avoided suffering, but that he fulfilled his calling. And in doing so, he became a flame that still burns, a voice that still speaks, and a banner that still waves. Not in the wind of this world, but in the breath of heaven. Service to the oppressed and thirsty is not simply a noble gesture. It is the very heartbeat of divine love in action. When Mola Abbas rode out to fetch water for the children in Karbala, he was not just responding to a physical need. He was carrying out a sacred mission that spoke volumes about his character, his heart, and his understanding of what it means to serve. That ride to the river in the face of enemy swords and certain death was not a military maneuver, it was a spiritual declaration. It said to the world that the oppressed matter, that the cries of the thirsty are heard by the faithful, and that service is the highest expression of love. This act was more than compassion, it was worship. It was the theology of love made visible on the battlefield. In the Christian tradition, we are taught to serve on the least of these. Jesus said, "Son, I was thirsty and you gave me drink." The act of giving water, often overlooked as small or insignificant, becomes an eternal deed when done in love. Mola Abbas lived this principle to its fullest. He didn't fetch water to prove his bravery, though bravery radiated from him. He didn't do it to be remembered, though history can never forget him. He did it because children were crying and his soul could not rest while even one child suffered. He did it because his love was not passive or poetic. It was practical, responsive, and sacrificial. He saw suffering and he moved. He heard the cries of thirst and he acted. That is what defines a true servant of God. His service wasn't limited to fetching water. That was simply the climax of a life lived in submission and care. From the beginning, Abbas stood not as a general seeking rank, but as a guardian of the innocent. Every glance he cast over the camp, every time he stood at the door of the tents, was a declaration that he existed to protect and serve those entrusted to him. His loyalty to Imam Hussain was not expressed merely in words or in battlefield valor. It was revealed in how he treated the weakest among them. He didn't ignore their needs, he centered them. He didn't see the thirst of the children as a distraction from the mission, it was the mission. This model of service challenges our definitions of greatness. In the world's eyes, greatness is often associated with titles, accolades, and dominance. But in the kingdom of God, greatness is found in serving the least, washing feet, bearing burdens, and going out of the way to meet the needs of others. Mola Abbas did not wear a crown. He wore dust and blood and the weight of other people's pain. And in doing so, he became royalty in the eyes of heaven. His service was so pure, so selfless, that even in death, he was victorious. The enemy thought they could silence his hands, but they only made his story louder. They thought cutting him down would end his legacy. But his legacy only began when he fell beside that dry river. Every believer is called to this kind of service. The thirsty may not always be children in a desert. They may be the brokenhearted, the abandoned, the voiceless in our own streets. They may be the ones sitting in pews with silent suffering, the neighbors drowning in loneliness, the outcast longing to be seen. To follow Christ means to do what Abbas did, to leave our comfort, to risk our safety, and to pour ourselves out like water, even when no one applauds and even when the cost is everything. It is in these moments that heaven draws near. It is in these moments that God is glorified. Abbas didn't wait for perfect conditions to serve. He didn't delay until he was sure of success. He acted when action was needed. He served because love demanded it. And though he never made it back with the water, his attempt was enough. His effort, his sacrifice, his broken body lying on the sand was more powerful than 100 victories, because he didn't just fight for water, he fought for dignity, for mercy, for love incarnate. That's the gospel written in swords and sand, in silence and tears. In the story of Mola Abbas, we see that the call to service is not for the convenient moments, but for the urgent ones. It's not for the qualified, but for the willing. It's not for the ones who ask what they can gain, but for those who ask what they can give. Service is not about position, it's about posture. Abbas knelt low so others could stand. He went out so others could stay safe. He died thirsty so others might live. That is the call of Christ. That is the path of saints. And that is the legacy that will outlive the dust of time. Spiritual kinship beyond bloodlines is a truth so profound it redefines the meaning of family, loyalty, and connection in the eyes of God. Mola Abbas was the half-brother of Imam Hussain by lineage, but his bond with Hussain surpassed any earthly relationship. It was not the blood in his veins that compelled him to stand by Hussain. It was the fire in his spirit, the depth of his faith, the clarity of his purpose. His loyalty was not rooted in the household he came from. It was rooted in the truth he stood for. He saw Hussain not just as a brother of flesh, but as the embodiment of divine truth, as the representative of the will of God on earth. That is why his allegiance was unshakable. That is why even death could not separate them. Because what connected them was not biology, it was belief. In the Christian faith, Jesus himself redefined family. When his mother and brothers came looking for him, he said, "Oh, who is my mother and who are my brothers? Those who do the will of my Father in heaven are my mother and brothers and sisters." That teaching breaks down every human boundary and elevates spiritual kinship above all else. It means that the most lasting relationships are not the ones formed by birth, but by calling, not by genes, but by grace. And that's exactly what we see in the bond between Abbas and Hussain. The relationship was forged in the furnace of faith. It was not maintained by sentiment, but by sacrifice. It was not based on mutual benefit, but on shared mission. Mola Abbas never once used his position as a brother to ask for privilege. He did not assume authority or demand recognition. On the contrary, he asked for permission to fight. He considered it an honor to serve, not a right. This humility reveals the true nature of spiritual kinship. It is not about status, it is about service. It is not about being close in name, it is about being united in heart. Abbas did not seek to lead beside Hussain, he sought to follow him to the end. That kind of relationship only grows where faith is the foundation. This spiritual bond is echoed in the lives of the early Christian disciples. Peter and John were not brothers by blood, but they stood side by side before councils and courts, united by their love for Christ. Paul and Timothy were not father and son, yet Paul called him his beloved son in the faith. These relationships were powerful not because of natural ties, but because they were built on the shared pursuit of God's kingdom. That is the model Mola Abbas lived out. His closeness to Hussain was sanctified by suffering, sealed by sacrifice, and elevated by eternity. What makes this kind of kinship so powerful is that it transcends time and place. Even today, millions across the world call Abbas their brother, not because of any shared ancestry, but because of shared reverence. His loyalty has created a family of the faithful. His devotion has drawn people from every walk of life to weep for him, to love him, to emulate him. And this teaches us something deeply theological, that the family of God is not defined by human boundaries but by heavenly values. It is not constrained by tribe, nation or bloodline. It is made up of those who walk in truth, who love without limits, who serve without conditions. In our world today, people are divided by race, by language, by politics, and even by religion. But the story of Abbas reminds us that when people are united in love and righteousness, they form a bond that no sword can sever. It invites us to build spiritual families, relationships anchored in faith and strengthened by service. It calls us to recognize that our true brothers and sisters are not necessarily those who share our name, but those who share our mission. This understanding brings healing. It brings unity. It brings purpose. The kinship between Abbas and Hussain was not based on what they could receive from one another, but on what they could give. It was a kinship that walked into the fire, that carried the weight of others, that spoke in silence and cried out in martyrdom. This kind of spiritual bond is what Christ offered his disciples. He called them friends, not servants. He said, there is no greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friends. Abbas lived those words. He laid down his life, not for a title, not for a family name, but for truth, for love, for the mission of God. In every step he took, Abbas invites us to build deeper bonds, not just in the flesh, but in the spirit. To recognize our spiritual kin, not by how they look or where they come from, but by how they live and what they believe. That is the kind of family that lasts forever. That is the kind of kinship that shakes the gates of hell and brings the kingdom of heaven closer to earth. And that is the legacy of Mola Abbas, brother in blood, but even more, brother in truth, in sacrifice, and in spirit. The eternal impact of temporary suffering is one of the most mysterious and profound truths that echoes through the life of Mola Abbas and finds its deepest resonance in the gospel of Christ. Pain, by its very nature, feels overwhelming in the moment. It screams for attention. It convinces the heart that this is all there is. But for those who walk the path of truth, suffering is never wasted. It becomes seed. It becomes legacy. It becomes eternal. Mola Abbas did not escape suffering. He embraced it. And in doing so, he lit a fire that still burns across generations. His wounds were not the end of his story. They were the beginning of something far greater. His agony in the battlefield of Karbala did not silence his voice. It amplified it beyond the grave. When Abbas rode into the chaos of Karbala, he knew what awaited him. He was not naive. He was not clinging to a false hope of survival. He had counted the cost. He had stared death in the face and still chose to press forward. Why? Because he understood that some suffering is temporary, but the meaning it carries lasts forever. He knew that a few moments of agony could inspire centuries of devotion. He knew that dying for truth was not a loss but a triumph. His body fell, but his soul rose, and with it rose the hearts of millions who would one day hear his story and be changed by it. This is the same power we find in the cross of Christ. Jesus hung in public, shame, beaten and broken. To the world it looked like failure. To the untrained eye, it was just another death. But heaven saw something different. Heaven saw redemption being poured out drop by drop. Heaven saw the Lamb of God silencing the power of sin. Heaven saw eternal life being made available through temporary suffering. What Jesus accomplished in 6 hours on a cross could never be undone because his pain was not pointless, it was purposeful. It was the same with Abbas. His arms were severed, but his strength was not. His eyes dimmed, but his legacy blazed. His death marked a moment in time, but the meaning stretched into eternity. In a world that constantly seeks to avoid pain at all costs, the life of Mola Abbas speaks something radical. Suffering embraced for a righteous cause does not destroy, it transforms, it redeems. It transcends the moment and plants seeds that blossom long after the body has fallen. Abbas could have stayed behind. He could have chosen self-preservation, but he didn't. He chose to pour himself out like a drink offering. And that choice became holy. That sacrifice became sacred. That pain became a testimony that no empire could erase, no enemy could silence. This truth is meant to comfort and strengthen every believer, because the Christian life is not free from suffering, it is marked by it. Jesus never promised an easy road, he promised a narrow one. He promised crosses, trials, persecutions, but he also promised something else, that nothing done in his name would be in vain, that every tear would be remembered, that every wound would be redeemed, that every hardship endured for righteousness would shine like gold in eternity. Mola Abbas's life is a living parable of that promise. Though he fell in dust and blood, he rose in honor. Though his end was violent, his memory is peaceful and pure. Temporary suffering, when endured for the sake of truth and love, gains weight that time cannot diminish. It speaks louder than sermons. It convicts more deeply than words. It pierces the heart and awakens the soul. The death of Abbas did not simply sadden, it awakened, it stirred hearts, it summoned courage, it revived love for justice and devotion to sacrifice. Just as the early Christians found courage in the suffering of Stephen, the first martyr, so too do millions find courage in the sacrifice of Abbas. His pain was a bridge, not a wall. It led people to deeper reflection, greater faith, and the willingness to lay down their lives for what is right. This is the mystery of God's design, that what seems weak becomes strong, that what looks like defeat becomes the foundation of victory, that what is broken becomes beautiful. Abbas was broken, but in his breaking, a new standard of love and courage was born. His suffering did not end his purpose, it fulfilled it. And in fulfilling it, he joined the great cloud of witnesses who, through blood and tears, testified that love is stronger than death, truth greater than tyranny, and sacrifice more lasting than success. To remember Mola Abbas is to remember that we are not called to comfort but to courage. We are not promised ease, but we are promised eternal impact. Whatever pain we endure in this life for the sake of righteousness will echo beyond time. That is the power of temporary suffering in the hands of a sovereign God. And that is the eternal voice of Abbas, calling us not to escape pain, but to endure it for a cause greater than ourselves, knowing that in God's economy, nothing is ever wasted.